I left before the speeches started, and what happened in the weeks that followed gave me back something I didn't know I'd been missing my whole life. My father's name is Howard. If you passed him on the street in Sudbury, maybe outside Canadian Tire, maybe at the Tim Hortons on LaSalle, you'd probably assume he was a retired millwright or maybe a long-haul driver who'd finally hung up his keys. He wears Carhartt jackets with frayed cuffs. He drives a 2009 F-150 with a cracked side mirror he's been meaning to replace for 3 years. He shakes hands with both of his, and he says, "Thank you" to cashiers and means it every single time. That's my father. That's the man I grew up watching, and for most of my adult life I thought I understood him completely. I was wrong. I need to back up about 2 years, to when I first met Rebecca's family. I'd been with Rebecca for about 14 months when she brought me to Rosedale for the first time. Her parents, her father Charles, and her mother Vivienne, lived in a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, and not a real estate magazine. More like the kind of magazine that comes with the newspaper on Saturdays, the one you flip through while your coffee goes cold, looking at people's lives and feeling vaguely inadequate. There was a gate. Not a fence, a gate with a call box. The driveway curved. I don't know why I remember the curve of the driveway so clearly, but I do. Maybe because my brain was already trying to process what kind of world I was walking into. Vivienne met us at the door. She was one of those women who manages to be perfectly composed without appearing to have tried. Her smile landed on me like a customs officer reviewing a passport. Polite, thorough, mildly suspicious. Charles came from somewhere deeper in the house and shook my hand with the grip of a man who wants you to know, immediately, that he doesn't need anything from you. Dinner was fine. I say fine the way you say fine about a doctor's appointment that didn't go badly but also wasn't pleasant. The food was extraordinary. Some kind of salmon with a sauce I couldn't name, served on plates I was afraid to set down wrong. The conversation covered all the acceptable topics. Where I worked, what I did, where I went to school. I'm a structural engineer. I'd done my degree at Waterloo. I'd been with the same firm in Toronto for 8 years, and I was good at my job. But in that dining room, with those plates and that chandelier, the words felt small coming out of my mouth. Nobody asked about my family that first night. I didn't think much of it. Rebecca and I got engaged in the spring. She cried. I cried a little. It was real, and I want to say that clearly. Whatever came later, what I felt for her in that moment was genuine. We'd built something together that I believed in. The engagement dinner was at Charles and Vivienne's house in Rosedale. My father drove down from Sudbury on his own, in the truck, showing up exactly on time in a flannel shirt and his good jeans, the dark blue ones he saves for occasions. My mother had passed away when I was 12. Dad had raised me by himself since then, taking on extra shifts at the shop, coaching my hockey team for 3 years, even though he barely knew the rules at the start, packing my lunches until I was old enough to be embarrassed about it, and then packing them 2 years longer because he didn't care whether I was embarrassed. He walked into Charles and Vivienne's front hall and looked around the way a person looks around when they're not trying to look impressed, and they're not trying to look unimpressed either. He just took it in. Then he found me across the room and his whole face changed. He put his hand on the back of my neck the way he always has since I was a kid, just a hand, no words, and that was enough. Vivienne watched that exchange from across the room. I noticed her watching. I told myself I was imagining things. The dinner itself was where things started to shift, even if I wouldn't admit it for a long time afterward. My dad sat next to Rebecca's aunt, a woman named Francine, who asked him what he did for a living with the specific intonation of someone who already assumed the answer would disappoint them. He told her he'd owned a machining shop outside Sudbury for the past 22 years. She said, "How interesting," in the voice people use when they mean the opposite. Dad just nodded and asked her about herself, and she spent the next 20 minutes talking. Charles made a comment at some point about tradespeople being the backbone of the country. It was meant to sound respectful. It didn't. Rebecca laughed at something her mother said right after, and I couldn't tell you now what the joke was. But I remember looking at her across the table and noticing that she hadn't gone out of her way to include my father in a single conversation all evening. I filed it away. You file these things away when you're in love. You build a little cabinet in the back of your mind, and you put them in there, and you close the door, and you don't go back. The months between the engagement and the wedding were busy in the way that wedding planning is always busy. A kind of controlled chaos where everyone has opinions, and somehow the two people actually getting married end up with the least say. The venue was a restored estate property outside of Caledon that Vivienne had booked before Rebecca and I had even discussed what we wanted. There were 280 guests on the final list. About 40 of them were people I knew. My father wasn't consulted about any of it, which I accepted as normal at first. When the seating chart came out 2 weeks before the wedding, he was placed at a table near the back. Table 14, the main tables, the family tables, were 1 through 6. Rebecca's second cousins she'd met twice were at table 5. I brought it up with Rebecca. She said the table assignments were complicated and Vivienne had spent a lot of time on them. I said my father should be closer to the front. She said we'd talk about it later. We didn't talk about it later. The rehearsal dinner was the Thursday before the Saturday wedding, at a private dining room at a steakhouse on King Street West. My father wore a navy blazer over a white shirt. He looked neat, respectable. He'd gotten a haircut. I noticed these things because I knew he'd made an effort, and I wanted to acknowledge the effort, even if only in my own head. Charles was in a suit that probably cost more than my father's truck. Vivienne wore something black and structured that communicated, without saying anything directly, that this was her event and she'd decided to register. The dinner went reasonably well until coffee. That was when Charles stood up to make a toast, which wasn't on the program, but wasn't surprising. He thanked the guests, talked about Rebecca, said a few things about looking forward to welcoming me into the family. Then he paused, and in that pause I felt something change in the room. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else probably noticed, and he said he hoped our children would inherit Rebecca's refinement and her eye for the finer things. He didn't look at my father when he said it. He didn't have to. My father picked up his water glass and took a slow sip and set it back down, and didn't change his expression at all. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat in my car in the parking garage on Richmond for almost half an hour. I wasn't angry, exactly. I wasn't ready to name what I was feeling. I called my dad. "You good?" he said when he answered. "I was going to ask you that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm fine, son. Get some sleep." That was it. That's always been it with him. He doesn't perform hurt. He never has. The wedding day itself started normally enough. I got dressed at the hotel with my two friends who were standing up for me. Guys I'd known since secondary school, one of whom had known my father for almost as long as I had. We took a cab to the venue. The estate was genuinely beautiful. Old stone, manicured grounds, a long lane of oak trees that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look like something you'd see on a postcard. The ceremony was outside. Rebecca was stunning. I won't take that away from her. She came down the aisle in a dress that her mother had clearly had significant input into, and she was beautiful. And I meant every word of the vows when I said them. It was the reception where everything collapsed. The cocktail hour went fine. I moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations and trying to track my father, who was working the room in his quiet way, talking to people, listening more than he spoke. He was good at that. He'd always been good at that. We went in for dinner. I was at the head table. My father was at table 14. The speeches started. Rebecca's brother gave one. Vivienne gave one. Charles gave one that lasted about 15 minutes and included a slideshow. My two friends gave one together that made people laugh. Rebecca cried. It was all very normal, and then I heard it. I almost missed it. The tables around the head table were loud. 280 people, an open bar, a good DJ warming up in the corner, and I was half turned in my chair talking to Rebecca when I caught a fragment of a conversation happening about 2 tables to my left. I heard the word trade. I heard the word look. And then I heard clearly, distinctly, in the carrying voice of Vivienne's sister, a woman named Harriet who I'd met exactly 3 times, the words, blue-collar trash. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The tables nearby went quieter in that ripple effect that happens when something lands wrong in a room. I looked at my father. He was sitting at table 14 with a small smile on his face and his hands folded on the tablecloth, looking toward the front of the room. He'd heard it. I knew he'd heard it. His posture hadn't changed by a millimeter. I looked at Rebecca. She was looking toward Harriet's table, and she was smiling, not a big smile. Not a laugh, but a smile, the small private kind that says, "I find this amusing." I sat with that for about 45 seconds. Then I stood up. I picked up my champagne glass and I tapped it twice. The room quieted the way rooms do when the groom stands up unexpectedly mid-dinner. I said I wanted to say something before the dancing started. I kept my voice level. I've thought about those words 100 times since, and I think I got them right. I said that I'd spent the last 2 years trying to fit into a version of my own life that had been prearranged for me, and that I'd told myself the parts that felt wrong were things I was imagining. I said I'd just heard a member of the bride's family refer to my father, the man who raised me alone, who worked 22 years building something from nothing, who drove 4 hours to be here, as trash. I said I'd turned to see how my new wife felt about that, and she'd smiled. I said I loved Rebecca, I meant that too. I said I couldn't marry someone who thought that was acceptable. The room was so quiet I could hear the DJ's equipment hum from the far corner. I set the glass down. I walked to table 14. My father looked up at me, and in his eyes there was no surprise. Not even relief. Just a kind of steady recognition, like he'd been waiting for me to get there, and he'd known I would eventually. I said, "Let's get out of here, Dad." He stood up, he buttoned his blazer, he tucked his napkin neatly under the edge of his plate. We walked out together. The calls started that night. Rebecca, Vivienne, Charles, Rebecca's brother, Harriet, of all people, who left a voicemail that was equal parts apology and justification. I let them go to voicemail. All of them. My two friends found me and my father at a diner on the highway, about 40 minutes outside the city. We sat in a booth and ate eggs, and my father had 2 cups of decaf, and we didn't talk about the wedding. We talked about the Leafs. We talked about what the summer looked like. The waitress refilled our coffees 3 times without being asked, and my father thanked her every single time. I didn't hear from Rebecca again for 11 days. When she finally called and I picked up, she was calm, measured. She said she was sorry I'd felt that way. I noticed the phrasing. She didn't say she was sorry for what happened. She said she was sorry I'd felt that way, which is a different thing entirely. I said I needed to understand something. I needed to understand why she'd smiled. She said Harriet had a way of saying things that were inappropriate, and she should have been more visibly upset, and she understood that. She said it was a stressful day. I asked if she thought my father deserved to be at table 14. She paused, then she said the seating had been complicated. We went around it a few more times, and at some point during that conversation, I understood that there was nothing to go around. The circle didn't lead anywhere new. We ended the call respectfully, which was its own kind of answer. About 3 weeks after the wedding that never finished, my father called me on a Sunday evening. He asked if I could come up to Sudbury for the weekend. I said of course. I drove up on a Friday after work, through the Shield country north of Barrie, where the rock cuts open up on both sides of the highway, and the sky gets bigger, and you start to feel like you can breathe again. I hadn't been sleeping well. I'd been going through the motions at work. The engineers in my office were careful around me, the way people are careful around someone going through something they don't fully understand. Dad met me at the door with a beer, which was his way of saying he'd noticed I needed one. We had dinner, pork chops, the ones he does with apple and mustard that I've been eating my whole life, and we talked about nothing important for a couple of hours. Then he said there was something he wanted to show me. He took me out to the workshop behind the house. It's a big space, climate-controlled, with fluorescent lights and tool cabinets my grandfather built decades ago. Workbenches run along both walls. In the middle, on a folding table, was a stack of folders and a laptop. He sat down and opened a folder and slid it across to me. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was looking at. The machining shop my father had been running for 22 years wasn't just a machining shop. It was the operating face of a holding company that owned 4 other industrial properties in northern Ontario. He had contracts with 2 mining corporations and a crown corporation I'd heard of all my life. There were investment accounts, real estate holdings, a numbered company I'd never known existed. I looked up at him. He looked back at me with that same steady expression. Not proud, exactly. More like patient. "Dad," I said, and then I didn't know what to say after that. He told me the whole thing slowly, in the way he tells stories. No rush, no drama, every word placed carefully. He'd started with the shop when I was very young. He'd been careful and methodical about every decision. He'd reinvested instead of spending. He'd bought properties when nobody else was buying. He'd made the kinds of decisions, over decades, that compound quietly. He said he'd lived the way he lived because it was the life he knew and trusted. The Carhartt jacket, the F-150 with a cracked mirror, the Tim Hortons on La Salle. None of it was performance. None of it was hiding anything. It was just who he was. The money had never changed who he was. He said he'd wanted me to grow up knowing how to work, knowing how to sit with people from any background and treat them like people. He said the worst thing that could have happened to me was to grow up thinking money made you better than anyone. I sat in that workshop for a long time after he finished. He got up and made coffee, actual coffee, not decaf this time, and set a mug in front of me. I should have told you sooner, he said. I wasn't sure when the right time was. Then that business with Rebecca made me think maybe it was time. I asked him why he hadn't said anything during all of it. During the engagement dinner, the rehearsal dinner, the seating chart, all of it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his mug. Because it wasn't about money, he said. If I'd walked in there and announced who I was, what would that have proved? That they were wrong to look down on me because I'm actually worth something? That's not what I want to teach you. The lesson isn't that you should respect people because they might be rich. The lesson is that you should respect people. He looked at me. You already knew that. You've always known it. You just needed to trust what you knew. There was a photo on the workshop wall that I'd looked at my whole life without really seeing. It was a picture of my parents, my mother and my father, standing in front of a small building. The building had a hand-painted sign. It was the original shop, back when it was nothing, back when he was starting. My mother had her hand on his arm and she was laughing at something off camera. He was looking at her. I asked what he wanted to do with all of it. He said it was mine. Whatever I wanted to do with it. I told him I didn't need it. I told him I had a job I was good at and an apartment I could afford, and that I didn't need what was in those folders. He smiled at that. He smiled the way you smile when someone says exactly what you were hoping they'd say. I went to bed in my old room that night, under the same plaid duvet that had been there since I was in secondary school. The house was quiet, the way only houses outside cities are quiet. Through the window I could see the corner of the workshop roof, and above it a genuinely ridiculous number of stars. I thought about Charles in his expensive suit, making his toast about refinement. I thought about Vivienne's composure at the door when we arrived. I thought about Harriet's voice carrying across the reception hall. I thought about Rebecca's small smile. And I thought about my father, in his navy blazer, sitting at table 14 with his hands folded and his expression unchanged. He hadn't needed anything from any of them. He'd never needed anything from any of them. And the clearest proof of that, the thing I understood lying in that childhood bed looking at the ceiling, was that he hadn't said a word. I flew back to Toronto on Sunday evening. I called my lawyer Monday morning, not because of the money, but because there were some practical things that needed to be handled now that the engagement was officially over. Then I called my two friends, individually, and we made plans to get dinner. I still see my father most months. He still drives the F-150. The cracked mirror has actually been replaced now. I bought him a new one for Christmas, which he pretended to be annoyed about. He still goes to the Tim Hortons on LaSalle, where the woman who works the morning counter knows his order without being asked. Rebecca and I have no contact. I don't wish her anything bad. I don't think she was a bad person. I think she had absorbed something from the house she grew up in, something about who counted and who didn't, and she had never had any reason to look at it closely. Maybe she has now. That's up to her. Harriet sent a letter, an actual handwritten letter. I read it. I put it in a drawer. I haven't decided what to do with it yet, and I might just leave it there. What I know is this. I got something back when I walked out of that reception hall. Something I couldn't have named before that night, because I didn't know it was mine to lose. My father had been carrying it for me for 37 years, and he handed it over in a workshop in Sudbury on a Friday night, over pork chops and bad fluorescent light. He was right that it wasn't about money. It was never about money. It was about knowing who you are when no one is watching. It was about knowing your table isn't 14, just because someone decided it was. It was about understanding that the man who shakes a cashier's hand and means it, who shows up on time in his good jeans, who folds his napkin neatly under the edge of his plate before walking out with his head up, that man is the one worth watching. I knew that. I'd always known it. I just needed to trust what I knew.